waiting to load. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining our panel on the COVID-19 vaccine Covaxin. I'm Kristen Kluska, one of the biotech analysts at Cantor. Participants on this panel include Dr. Shankar Musunuri, the chairman, CEO, and co-founder of Ocugen, as well as 3 members of Ocugen's Vaccine Scientific Advisory Board, Dr. Satish Chandran, CEO of Solution, former CTO at Pfizer Biotherapeutics, COO and CSO of Nucleonics, and head of DNA vaccines at Wyeth Vaccines. Dr. David Feigenbaum, assistant professor of medicine in translational medicine and human genetics at the University of Pennsylvania, and founding director of Center for Cytokine Storm Treatment and Laboratory, and Dr. Bruce Forrest, former senior vice president at Wyeth Vaccines. Thank you all for your participation today. While today's conversation will focus on Covaxin, we previously hosted the Ocugen team for a fireside chat on the ophthalmology programs and would be happy to follow up with anybody on that. So first, I'd like to get to know everybody on this team a little bit better and pose a few introductory questions. The first for Dr. Musunuri. Ocugen has primarily focused on therapies related to ophthalmology conditions since its inception. So when you announced plans to co-develop Covaxin with Bharat Biotech in December, this was viewed as a surprise. Could you please walk us through why you wanted to lead the company in this direction?
Kristen, thank you for having us today. And again, many of folks on the call may not know, I played a significant role at Pfizer. Prior to that, it's Wyeth Vaccines in leading the global operations team for Prevnar 13, which became the largest selling vaccine in the world, over 100 countries. And also, this is a pandemic, right? I mean, many people are losing lives. And we know we have a lot of expertise. We can put a very strong vaccine team together, and we can contribute. That's the reason we jumped in and steer the company in the direction. And I think we cannot sit on the sidelines. If you have knowledge, you have experience, you have network, I think people have to jump in and contribute. And that's why, we jumped in. We really want to be a solution, one of the solutions for the pandemic and bringing this under control.
Thank you. So you alluded to your previous experience with Prevnar 13 at Pfizer. Could I ask you to highlight some of the key learnings and synergies you could bring from this experience to potentially marketing Covaxin if approved?
Yeah, I mean, again, when you work in a large pharma, you got a global teams, and how do you handle? I mean, again, Bruce here, managed all our global clinical trials. He managed very well. He ran many of them, right? And so, I mean, looking from R&D perspective, how do you move the process into the clinic? Manufacturing is very key element of it. I think you have seen vaccine manufacturing is very complex. How do you line that up and make sure you have robust processes so that, you don't have supply interruptions when you get something approved. And then from commercial perspective, I think, that's again, even with the COVID, it's even more relevant than before because you do have to work with the governments. And I think all the people in the US, they all got commitments. And that's how every government is doing across the globe. And those learnings will be very, very useful. How do you do the clinical trials? How do you get the product approved? How do you manage the manufacturing and supply? And how do you work with the different governments? And how do you position your product?
Thank you. So the next question is for Dr. Chandran. Your career has spanned from academia to industry in both pharma and biotech companies over the course of 3 decades, including a wealth of experience in the regulatory and commercialization side of the business. How do you think that your broad perspective and deep experience has benefited you now that you are focusing on responding to a global pandemic in what can only be described as an all hands on deck type of movement?
Yeah, developing a product from an idea to a product in the commercial space, I've done this several times. but this is a different ball game altogether. The speed is of the essence. We have to crush the traditional timelines down to very, very small numbers. I think the biggest asset we have here is not just one person's, my experience here and knowledge in the regulatory and developing products, but it is the team. As Shankar mentioned, here we have Oxygen has assembled a great team of people who have accomplished in multiple spheres along the pathway, from the research and development to manufacturing to supply chain management and regulatory and so on. I think that together, the hands on deck is, I think we have a great team to be able to execute that.
Thank you. And Dr. Feigenbaum, your own experience and work around Castleman disease inspired the Penn Center for Cytokine Storm Treatment and Laboratory to start the Corona Project. Further, a lot of your work around understanding COVID-19 has been featured in prominent publications. Can you tell us some more about this and perhaps the challenges that this leads to in treating and preventing the disease, perhaps also from a vaccine perspective?
Sure. So you're absolutely right. I became particularly interested in wanting to try to make a difference in this pandemic when it became clear the similarities between the most severe cases of COVID-19 and what's called a cytokine storm. Cytokine storms are conditions that involve the immune system getting out of control and wreaking significant havoc and killing patients. This is why COVID is so deadly. And given the similarities between COVID, cytokine storms, and the conditions that I've been studying for the last decade, I felt that I had this responsibility to really dive in, launch the Corona Project, begin to search for treatments that may be effective for the most severe cases. And you can imagine that there's a lot that we learn about the most severe cases and how COVID can wreak so much havoc that can also be applied to trying to prevent COVID in the first place, and better understanding what is the immune response to COVID. What could that immune response look like to a vaccine that could actually prevent developing COVID in the first place? So I felt a real responsibility to join the effort, both from a therapeutics perspective, searching for drugs to save lives, but also earlier stage on the vaccine side, and really thrilled to be a part of this team, as was mentioned earlier, that's been assembled.
Thank you. And Dr. Forrest, you were involved in vaccine, pharmaceutical, and biologic development for 25 years as a physician in industry. Further, you have a lot of international experience, which is relevant for COVAXIN, including launching multiple trials ex-US. Could you tell us more about the insights you gained, especially when it comes to bringing something safe and efficacious to the market as rapidly as a COVID-19 vaccine?
In fact, in the last 25 years, there's been a major improvement in the quality of global clinical trials. We see it across the board with small companies and large. The International Conference on Harmonization, which was originally set up between the US and Europe and Japan, but is now expanded to include other member countries, it sets standards to enable clinical trials that are performed in any given country to meet the standards required by other countries for their approval. And that's what we're seeing with a quality partner such as Bharat Biotech in this, is that they have made that commitment to do clinical trials to comply with those global standards, those international requirements that will satisfy approvals in countries well beyond just that they've done in India, and especially here in the US. So one of those key things is its consistency, quality, and a commitment to that. And that's what we're seeing, and that's why Oxygen has progressed with that partnership.
Thank you. So now let's dig into some questions specifically related to COVAXIN. So the first question I have for the panel is, when you first announced plans to pursue COVAXIN development in the US last December, the world was focused on the recent EUAs that were granted to Pfizer and Moderna. Around the same time, we were learning about the first widely reported variant that emerged from the UK. So could you tell us what you think is important to understand about the whole variant inactivated vaccine approach of COVAXIN in light of these mutable variants, and how this could potentially interact with our immune systems to produce lasting immunity? And how else might COVAXIN differentiate from some of these other vaccines? And here I'll start with Dr. Feigenbaum, please.
Sure. So one of the things that I'm most excited about with COVAXIN is that this is a well-established platform. inactivated vaccines have been around for decades and more recently have continued to be approved for a number of different conditions. So I think the fact that it's a well-established platform that has a long track record that's safe is the number one differentiator that I'm optimistic about. The second piece of that, which is very much related, is that a number of individuals that are hesitant to get a COVID vaccine are actually afraid of the technology. They're afraid of something that's brand new, whether it's an AAV or RNA. So this idea that you can use an existing platform that nearly everyone in the United States has actually already received an activated vaccine, this I think can lead towards further expanding vaccine uptake. I also should mention that I'm a patient with a disease called Castleman disease, and so it involved immune system hyperactivation, and this sort of experience going through cytokine storms has made me realize just how serious this condition is. And so the idea that patients like me can receive protection from a vaccine like Covaxin, I think is really important. And the last point to get to your comment around variants is that the fact that we have complete coverage of the entire virus through a whole inactivated vaccine means that we're much more likely to have complete coverage against variants as they emerge.
Thank you. And Dr. Chandran, the same question, please.
Yeah, I second everything that David just pointed out. I do want to share some of the results that were presented at the phase 1 and 2 particularly, which has been published in reputed journals like Lancet, for example, and clearly shows the value of presenting multiple antigens. We talk about other vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, or the AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, or Novavax, for example. They're all focused on the S protein, the one protein that is changing with these variants. And we're all concerned about escape mutants and so on. The beauty of this vaccine is that what it showed was it was able to promote a solidly good immune response against the invariant portion of the virus, such as the N protein. So presenting a number of antigens gets around the possibility of variants. I'm not saying there will never be variants that will probably escape Covaxin, but the probability is extremely small. You reduce, and just another point that I would like to add to what David said, given the safety profile and the decades of use, what it means is the acceptance. In dealing with a pandemic, it is not about just being able to manufacture enough to be able to supply the global demand, but it's also about acceptance. Given what it is, the learning curve of an inactivated virus that we've gone through over tens of years, probably nearly 50 years, I think the comfort level is greater. And therefore, acceptance is probably good. We're not dealing with a new technology that is that has come about only in the context of COVID. So I think those are the key things I want to make a point out. One other thing, just going back to padding up on the previous discussion that I had. I stated is that we talk about variants. So is it possible that Covaxin, and given the data that they have presented, is able to neutralize multiple variants? Could this be the solution for all variants, even as a booster?
Thank you. Appreciate that insight. So the next question I have is, what is the history of the whole variant and activated vaccine platform? And why did Bharat realize that this would be a successful way to deliver a COVID-19 vaccination? Further, could you also describe some examples of where this platform has been successful in the past, such as in the case of polio? And here I'll start with Dr. Forrest, please.
In fact, if you look at how each of the companies have reacted, historically, when there's a crisis and you need to make a vaccine, you dig deep into your toolkit. What is it that you have that you're comfortable can be used to move quickly to address that crisis? And in Bharat's case, the inactivated vaccine platform has been one that they have very successfully developed and commercialized throughout the world outside of the United States. They have an activated rabies virus vaccine, an activated polio vaccine, and including a Japanese bee encephalitis, all serious diseases that can be associated with significant mortality, as we all know. And so they had a very successful platform, established manufacturing standards, that made them think back and say, if we want to make the best possible vaccine that addresses the broadest possible immune response, then let's go with the technology that will deliver that. And so from their platform, that's what they did and have done so, as we've seen from the interim data to date, very successfully. In the US, this is also not an unusual situation. The inactivated polio stopped an epidemic in the 1950s with an inactivated vaccine. And it came back again when we needed to have a vaccine with a better safety profile than the existing product we had with the live oral vaccine. So we've done that with polio, and it's a recommended vaccine for our children. That's also true with hepatitis A vaccine. The Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices at the CDC recommends that children in this country get an inactivated hepatitis A vaccine. So once again, this is not some radical, unusual technology. It's not one where there are significant safety questions. It's the technology that they've established very successfully internationally, making vaccines that are comparable to approaches that have been used in the US for routine vaccines to date.
Thank you. And Dr. Musunuri? You are on mute.
Okay. Bruce highlighted very well the salient points here. I think once again, this is a platform which has been used for ages and produce like hepatitis and polio vaccine, where all our children, babies in this country, infants receive it even today, and it's safe. And Bharat Biotech has a significant experience producing various vaccines on the same platform, over 300 million doses delivered to date. I think that's very important, right? I think having that experience, and as I mentioned to you during the pandemic, it's not only developing it and make sure the product has a probability of high safety. How do you get that in the middle of it? It's based on the experience and history. What else was developed before? How did our infants, children do with that, or adults? I think we need to take all this into consideration. And also, as I mentioned before, manufacturing is complex with any vaccine, okay? And in the middle of the pandemic, if you're trying to scale this up, I mean, this would be the best option, right? These guys have a lot of experience, and they're not doing this for the first time. They've been producing vaccines on the same platform for many, many years, and now they're plugging this in. That helps a lot to robust scale up and tech transfers, even for us in the future when we're bringing manufacturing to US.
Great, thank you. So moving on to some of the efficacy findings we've seen. As of today, Bharat Biotech has reported phase 1 data from about 375 subjects, phase 2 data from about 380 subjects, and the interim readout of the phase 3 study in about 27,000 subjects, which saw 36 cases of COVID-19 in the placebo group versus 7 in the Covaxin group, which translated to an efficacy profile of 81%. Perhaps digging into these recent phase 3 data, could I ask you to highlight the most important takeaways from the earlier trials, including the IgG responses, the T-cell responses, and other humoral and cell response findings, and anything else you think we should consider? I'll start with Dr. Chandran here, please.
All right, thank you. You're right. We all saw the results of the interim analysis with 81% point estimate of efficacy. But it's all about contextual. So we will talk about it. It appears to be as efficacious as any other leading vaccines out there, the Moderna, Pfizer vaccines, for example. But I think what, to me, the most exciting part of the story was the responses to, as I mentioned earlier, both the S and the N protein, both humoral and cellular responses were observed in there. The IgG classes, the cytokine profile favored a Th1 response. That's absolutely great. We're talking about from an efficacy, immediate efficacy point of view, it is as comparable as the ones out there. When I compare Covaxin, I'm comparing it to the Moderna, Pfizer. But I think what remains to be seen is what is the longevity of the response. How well it is going to deal with the variants. Feel good about the variants because of the multiple antigenic responses. The the little data that we have seen, there is no diminishing of the response over the period of time. The last few months of the phase 1 and phase 2 patients have been continued to be followed, and they seem to remain approximately where the peak activity was. The immunological correlates were identical or better than any other vaccines that ever have been tested so far. So those are the major highlights that I would like to point out about Covaxin that distinguishes it, and the probability of it being able to address variants is I think probably the biggest takeaway from the phase 3 study.
Thank you. And Dr. Forrest?
Ocugen's partner Bharat has been phenomenally transparent in publishing their data in a way that you're not seeing perhaps from many of the other opportunities out there. They've published all their early data, all their immunogenicity, and their T cell data. The efficacy so far from the interim is looking very positive and very favorable to date. But also remember, going back to Dr. Feigenbaum, Dr. Chandran's comments on the immune response, the press and public and even public health officials are enamored with antibody responses because they're easy to measure. It's the easiest thing in the immune system to measure. And yet they're only one part of making a successful immune response. And a lot of the things that you don't hear about, the cellular immune responses, which are the critical part of the immune system responsible for the recovery, for providing you with the improvement in your outcome, is rarely looked at. And yet Bharat has done that, and they've published those data looking at their markers for measurement of cellular immunity. And you're going to see with a lot of these other proteins, the other antigens that are in this vaccine are critical for making those responses. So while many companies are narrowly focused on that part of the virus for which you can make and measure antibodies, and that is certainly an important part of it. Not only do you get that with Bharat, you also get an improvement potentially in outcomes of people who might get a breakthrough, who might get an infection, because they'll make, and they've demonstrated they're making good cellular immune responses against broader panel of antigens. So, this is consistent with what you're seeing with this efficacy profile to date.
Thank you. And then the phase 3 data that was reported earlier this month, could you please speak to the diversity of the subjects in the trial and your take on the data disclosed? And how does this compare to some of the other vaccines in development or approved under EUA? And Dr. Forrest, if I could have your thoughts on this first.
Absolutely. The diversity is found in many different ways in vaccine studies. Remarkably, vaccines have essentially similar profiles worldwide in the populations to date. You see this with vaccines such as Prevnar, you see it with rotavirus vaccines, such diverse vaccines. There are certain select populations for which you may get less of an immune response, but they still have a degree of protection that they wouldn't otherwise have. So with vaccines, data worldwide, for the most part, is easily portable and demonstrates uniformity of coverage within the boundaries that we work. The other thing is, India is not a monolithic block of homogeneous people. It is a very diverse community. It has the same diversity in age, weight, body mass index, underlying conditions. And so the data is coming from a very broad cross-section of that community, both economically as well and socially. And so you're getting a spread of data in a population that is reassuring, that the data you're seeing is one that can be reliably expected to be translated around the world. And I think that's important. Now, remember, a lot of the other countries are doing their vaccines only in select communities. For example, only in the UK, or perhaps only in Brazil. And that may not necessarily, on the face of it, look like that it's going to be translatable to other parts of the world. But let's go back to the fact that for the most part, the human immune response behaves the same way in each of us, within variabilities, some not so great, some better. And the results that we see fit within that band of likely projections. So far, this is very likely to be translatable to experiences that can be seen around the world.
Thank you.